Hey everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories. And if you're a returning viewer, welcome back, friend. Your support truly means the world. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel more than you know. This little community keeps growing thanks to all of you, and I'm so grateful to have you here. In this video, we're going back to the Appalachian Mountains to explore 3 stories that were sent in by viewers. These are personal accounts from people who've lived through some truly unsettling moments out there. The last story is actually one of my favorites out of everything I've ever received, so if you stick around till the end, let me know what you think of it. Remember, viewer discretion is advised. I was born in Wyoming County, West Virginia. That probably doesn't mean much to most people, but to those who've driven the winding, hollow roads between Coretta and War, the name alone is enough to conjure a kind of slow, pressing dread. It's a forgotten part of the state. No hospitals, no Walmart, not even a traffic light. You don't come out this way unless you have a reason. And even then, you don't stay long. I left when I was 23. The first stretch of 4-lane road had just opened. Barely 10 miles of asphalt pretending to connect us to the rest of the world. It didn't. The Appalachians don't let go that easy. Even now, years later, I feel like some part of me is still tangled up in those woods, like something followed me out. There was one particular trip I took back there that I think about more than I should. It wasn't long after I'd left. My uncle had died suddenly, and the family expected me to help sort through his place outside of War. It was the middle of January. Cold had sunk into the ground so deep it felt like even the trees were holding their breath. I hadn't been back in 3 years. The drive from Welch to War is never pleasant. It isn't just the narrow roads, the blind curves, the old coal trucks that still barrel around like they own the place. It's the feeling that the mountains are swallowing you the deeper you go. Between Coalwood and Coretta, the trees close in so tight, the sky disappears. There were moments I forgot I was even in daylight. Just curve after curve, trees clawing at the edge of the road. No sign of life except the occasional trailer buried in the brush. I stayed in my uncle's house for 3 days. It was a sagging structure at the base of a ridge, surrounded by rusting cars and stripped appliances. He'd been a reclusive man, a hoarder in the true sense. The kind of person who filled every inch of space with junk because he couldn't stand the silence. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. The first night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared, but because it was so quiet it hurt. The kind of silence that presses into your eardrums, makes you hear the blood in your own veins. Out here, there's no hum of traffic, no distant neighbors. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of something shifting in the woods. And God, those woods. They felt alive, not in the mystical enchanted forest sense. No. Alive like something watching, waiting, breathing. On the second day, I decided to hike up behind the house, toward an old logging road that used to be active when I was a kid. The plan was to find a cell signal, maybe get a few bars so I could check in with my brother. As I climbed, I noticed how little had changed. Same muddy ruts, same fallen branches. But there was something else, a sense of weight, like the woods were leaning toward me. I can't explain it better than that. About a mile up, I found a clearing where the ridge dropped off. You could see the whole hollow from there. The house looked like a speck. The road leading into town barely visible. I stood there for a long time, shivering and trying to shake the feeling that I shouldn't be there. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't even fear. It was primal instinct. like I'd stepped out of bounds in a game I didn't know I was playing. Even though I felt like a complete stranger in that area. The truth is, I'd spent countless hours there as a kid, running around and playing with my two brothers. When I turned to go back, I saw something that made me pause, not because it was particularly dramatic or startling at first glance, but because it didn't belong. There were prints in the soft, leaf-covered dirt, not mine, and not fresh, but recent enough to hold their shape against the damp. They trailed off toward the far side of the ridge, veering away from the old paths and moving into terrain so steep and overgrown that no one would choose to walk it unless they had to. The prints in themselves weren't alarming. Even though that land still technically belonged to my uncle, it wouldn't have been all that unusual for someone to have passed through there. People wandered through the hills from time to time, hunters maybe, or someone cutting across to another hollow. But the direction felt wrong. Not just unusual, but almost deliberate in its avoidance of where people were supposed to go. I followed their path with my eyes, trying to make sense of the decision someone had made to walk that way. And that was when I saw it. Deep among the trees, far enough that I couldn't make out much more than a suggestion of shape. Something, or someone, was standing completely still. It was just a vertical form, vaguely human, shadowed between two tree trunks where the light didn't quite reach. There was no movement, not even the sway of someone shifting their weight or brushing away a branch. Nothing. But I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't explain how. I couldn't even be sure it was a person. The light was low, but the sensation of being observed was immediate and absolute. I stood frozen for a moment, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden understanding that I had wandered too far into something I didn't fully comprehend. Then came another kind of feeling, a sense of recognition, something old and, in a way, unsettling, but also strangely comforting, like I'd seen it there before, like I'd grown up with that presence. I didn't call out. I didn't try to convince myself it was a tree, or a shadow, or anything that might offer more comfort. I just turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it moved. That night, I locked every door and window. Slept with a kitchen knife by the bed, though I never really slept. Every creak in the floorboards felt intentional, like someone was stepping carefully. I knew it was just monkeys in my head, but even so, they were there. I left before dawn. Didn't even bother finishing packing up the place. Told my mom I got what I needed. The plain truth is, for all I cared, that house could rot. On the way home, I called my older brother and asked him directly if he'd ever seen anything, or anyone, in those woods. He didn't say much about what he'd seen, but he told me he once mentioned it to our grandmother, and she gave it a name. Then he said he'd left all that behind, and didn't want to talk about it anymore. I didn't push. Years have passed since then. My mother eventually came to live with me, leaving that part of the country behind. But even after all this time, I still dream about that trail down the ridge, and that same sense of a presence lingering there never really left me. Actually, it's not just sometimes. It's constant. A recurring dream. Something I'm not sure I'll ever shake. I often remember my grandmother's words. You don't need ghosts when you have the mountains. They'll eat you just the same. A few years back, I spent 2 weeks driving solo through the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains, taking time off after a rough breakup and a job I'd stayed in too long. I didn't have a clear plan, just a cooler of food, my tent, and a worn-out trail map of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I'd always loved hiking, and I figured the isolation would help clear my head. I wasn't expecting peace exactly, but I wanted stillness. I got something else. By the end of the first week, I'd already camped at several sites along the North Carolina side, mostly near popular trails. Crowds were thin, It was mid-October, just after the fall foliage rush, and the nights had started to dip below freezing. Most of the other hikers I ran into were older couples or Appalachian Trail thru hikers pushing south before winter. I set my sights on a more remote section of the park just west of Clingman's Dome, off one of the lesser-known trailheads that branched off from the Forney Ridge area. I parked at a gravel turnout around noon and packed lightly, just a tent, sleeping bag, food for one night, and my water filter. I figured I'd hike a few miles in, set up camp near the creek I'd seen marked on the map, and hike back out the next morning. It was supposed to be simple. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown in places, definitely not well maintained. Every so often, I had to stop and push branches out of the way or climb over fallen trees. I passed no one, not a single soul. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I didn't think much of it at the time. I welcomed the silence. Around 3:30 p.m., I reached a clearing beside the creek. The trees formed a tight canopy overhead, and the water ran smooth over mossy rocks. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Isolated, shaded, peaceful. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, took off my boots, and soaked my feet in the cold creek for a while. The sun dipped behind the hills earlier than I expected, and shadows stretched long and deep. I boiled some water for noodles, ate in silence, and listened to the wind pushing through the trees. Still, no other hikers, no animals, not even birdsong. When it got dark, it got dark. My headlamp barely punched through the blackness outside the tent. I stayed awake reading for a while, then zipped myself into the sleeping bag and tried to drift off. I'd camped more times than I could count. I was no stranger to nights alone in the woods. In fact, that trip alone, it was already my third or fourth night sleeping in the tent. The occasional crack of a branch or rustling in the brush didn't bother me. Out here, those sounds were a good sign. The forest goes quiet when something's really wrong. Silence. That's what gets under your skin. That night, the usual sounds were back. Crickets. Small animals moving in the undergrowth. I actually found it comforting, but still, I couldn't fall asleep. I'd been tossing around for what felt like hours. Something just wasn't letting me settle. I didn't feel scared. It was more like a pressure in my chest, like my body knew something I didn't. Eventually, I gave up trying to force it. I flicked the headlamp back on and grabbed my book, thinking maybe if I read a few pages, I'd doze off. But midnight came and went. I was tired, bone tired, but wired at the same time, like some old instinct wouldn't let me shut down. Then I heard a cough. Not an animal sound, not the forest shifting or the wind moving through the trees. It was human. Somewhere near the trail, maybe 20 or 30 yards off. I froze. The book dropped into my lap, and I just sat there listening. But as the seconds went by, everything stayed silent. I didn't even think. I unzipped the sleeping bag and reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly opened the tent flap. That's when I saw her, sitting right at the edge of the creek, maybe 10, 15 feet away. I couldn't see her face. She was turned away from me. But from the long hair, the shape of her shoulders, I was sure it was a woman. She was completely still. I think what scared me the most was that even just seeing her hair and part of her back, the woman looked completely lost. Her hair was loose, tangled, and the dress she was wearing was torn on the right side. I wanted to say something, ask if she was okay, but my voice just wouldn't come out. I was shining a light right at her. Any normal person would have looked back, would have reacted, but she didn't move. I managed to snap out of it after a few seconds and quickly scanned the woods around her, then the area around my tent. But there was nothing. No movement. No one else. So I turned the light back to the creek, and she was gone. Just gone. I started sweeping the beam everywhere. Left, right, behind trees, even up into the branches. But there was no sign of her. Not a sound. Not a footstep. Absolutely nothing. And that made it worse. Seeing her was one thing. Not seeing her anymore, that was way more terrifying. I stepped out of the tent, barefoot, and moved toward the creek. The flashlight was shaking in my hand, and the only thing I could think of was her suddenly rushing me from the dark. The image made me physically sick. When I got to where she'd been, I saw something that stopped me cold. Footprints. Bare ones, pressed into the damp earth near the edge of the water. She'd been there. There was no doubt. But where the hell had she gone? I packed up my tent as fast as I could and got back on the trail. I spent the rest of the night constantly looking over my shoulder. The only thing running through my head was the image of that woman suddenly charging out of the trees, completely unhinged. When I finally made it back to my car, I reported what I'd seen to the park rangers. I had no idea what she was doing out there, but the whole situation felt completely surreal. The story I'm about to tell you isn't particularly long, and it might not seem extraordinary at first. But trust me, it takes a turn. I'll admit I've never been great at paying attention to detail, and I'm not exactly talented when it comes to describing things with emotion or precision. But if you've got the patience to stick with me until the end, I promise what happened is as absurd as it is real. And it might even make you look at certain situations a little differently. It's not just surreal. To me, it's the ultimate proof that every story has at least two sides. And no matter how convinced we are of our perspective, there's almost always another angle we know absolutely nothing about. It was early spring, and since I've always been a nature lover, I grew up surrounded by it in the small town of Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. I kicked off the season by hitting the trails. I've always loved this time of year. To me, the real new year doesn't begin in January, but when everything starts growing, blooming, and coming back to life. That's when I feel like the world is truly turning again. The plan was simple. Spend 3 full days on one of the Appalachian trails, completely off the grid and fully immersed in nature. But what was supposed to be 3 days of peace turned into 2 days of calm, followed by a 3rd day of fear that stayed with me. I know the area really well, and I've hiked those trails countless times, so I feel confident enough to step off the main paths and explore the wilder, less traveled routes, where the real beauty and solitude still haven't been overrun by tourists. These are places few people ever walk through, where you can go hours, sometimes days, without seeing another soul. I had just left the main trail, aiming to return to a secluded clearing I had camped in the previous year. I remember the place clearly. 2 large open spaces separated by a small still water pond, surrounded by shade and silence. When I arrived, it looked exactly like I remembered. Peaceful, untouched, beautiful. I set up my tent, organized my gear, and by the end of the day, while gathering some dry wood for a small campfire, I stumbled on something that went far beyond simple unease. I felt a kind of fear so raw and visceral, I could barely think straight. I knew that over the years, there had been several disappearances in that area. Stories I'd always heard with a fair amount of skepticism, but hearing rumors or reading old newspaper clippings is one thing. Stumbling across physical evidence right in front of your eyes is a whole different beast. I was picking up branches when I noticed something sticking out from the undergrowth. As I got closer, I realized it was part of a skull, badly decayed, dirty, covered in moss, and I couldn't immediately tell if it was human or animal. A few feet ahead, though, I found a long bone that I instantly recognized as very likely being a human tibia. That alone would have been enough to freak me out. But what made it worse was the fact that the night before, I'd been watching videos I had downloaded to my phone before the trip. Stuff about local folklore and serial killers who'd operated in that very mountain region. The combination of those videos and the bones made for one hell of a mental cocktail, and I went into a near constant state of alert. Still, I tried to keep calm. I kept telling myself everything was fine, that there was no need to panic, and that as soon as the sun came up, I'd pack up and leave that place as quickly as I could. But around 11 p.m., I started hearing noises outside the tent. Not super close, but loud enough to make me tense. They sounded like footsteps or movement in the bushes. I froze, my brain running through every possible scenario. Wild animals, people, accidents, escaped lunatics. We all think those things only happen to other people. A few minutes later, I heard water thrashing violently. I had pitched my tent near the pond, and the sounds were coming from that direction. They weren't close, but they were loud and frantic, like something or someone was panicking. I stayed completely still, trying to make sense of it, when I clearly heard what sounded like a human sound. I don't know, but at that moment, I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed the knife I always carry, unzipped the tent slowly, and stepped outside. I moved toward the sounds as quietly as I could, and what I saw is something I still have trouble believing. On the other side of the pond, lit only by pale moonlight, I saw a completely naked man running wildly through the trees. It was such a bizarre sight, almost comical if it hadn't been so damn disturbing in that setting. In the middle of nowhere, no explanation, a guy sprinting naked through the forest like he was running for his life. That was the breaking point for me. I didn't care about anything else. I packed up whatever I could, grabbed my food bag, which I always hung from a branch, away from where I sleep. And when I got there, it was all torn apart and scattered on the ground. My first thought was that it had been a bear. That's the whole reason for hanging the food. But if it had been a bear, there would have been more damage, claw marks, and I probably would have heard more chaos. I left the food, grabbed only the essentials, and booked it out of there as fast as I could. As soon as I got to my car, I called the police and told them everything, especially about the bones, which I figured was the most serious part. For weeks, even months, I kept replaying that night in my head. I couldn't figure out what had really happened. The guy clearly wasn't okay, and I kept wondering what had become of him. Was he on something, running naked through the forest at midnight? Then, one day, while I was scrolling aimlessly through Reddit, I stumbled across a post that chilled me to the bone. It was a story posted by someone named Derek. According to him, he'd been camping at the exact same pond on the exact same night. In his post, he described it being a warm night. And as I later found out, he had a habit of taking midnight swims in these secluded ponds. Thinking he was completely alone, he stripped down and jumped in. He'd been in the water for about 5 minutes when he started hearing noises on the shore. When he turned to look, he freaked out. There was a huge bear rummaging through his clothes, trying to get at the energy bars he'd left in his shorts pocket. The clothes were being torn apart, but then the bear saw him and lost interest in the snacks, and gained interest in Derek. The only thing he could do was run, completely naked, through the opposite side of the pond, deep into the woods. I don't think I've ever felt so stupid and so entertained by a Reddit post at the same time. I messaged him immediately. The noises I'd heard that night were both Derek and the bear. But Derek hadn't seen me and I hadn't seen the bear. And that's how we met. What started as something terrifying and surreal has become our favorite story to tell. We've become great friends, and since then, we've done countless hikes together. Needless to say, we laugh until we cry every time we tell the story of how we met. Most people think we're making it up, and honestly, I don't even blame them.